Hello, everyone, and welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. Earlier this month, the National Pork Producers Council released a new economic report highlighting how America's pig farmers are significant contributors to the United States agricultural and overall economy. From farm to fork, the combined economic contribution from hog production and pork processing supports more than 600,000 American jobs and generates $170 billion of direct, indirect, and induced sales that equates to $57 billion in value added GDP. Joining us to discuss the findings and dive into the state level data is Holly Cook, NPPC staff economist. Welcome, Holly, and thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Ann. I'm excited to talk more about these reports and really dive into some of those results today.
Well, let's start with some background on how the report was generated, how those sales figures were collected, and how you determined all the jobs that need to be included in the report.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I have actually a couple slides that will kind of help us walk through the report and kind of give some background. So if we look at the economic contribution studies or the reports themselves, these are really comprehensive reports of the pork industry at the national level and then for 22 individual states. So the reports are kind of split into three different sections. We have a look at current industry demographics at the farm level, where we use the most recent Census of Agriculture data to look at the number of farms, production levels, and things like that. And then we also use some of that information as well as other data to come up with estimates of the total economic activity that the pork industry supports. So this includes gross output or the overall sales values that are supported by the pork industry, as well as the number of jobs and the overall personal income and value added levels that are tied to pork industry activity. And then each report ends with kind of a summary of some of the current challenges and opportunities that we're facing in the pork industry. So to look a little bit closer at that economic activity estimates, we can break this down even further. So when we talk about calculating the overall importance of the pork industry, that of course starts with what's going on at the farm level. So this is where we kind of look at those direct effects. We start with production budgets that look at hog farming at the US level and for each individual state. And so I worked with Dr. Lee Schultz at Iowa State University on this portion. So Lee has these production budgets that are developed. It's an individual model for each state, looks at the number and the type of operation and the size of the farms in each state to calculate how many hogs are brought to market each year, and then what inputs are required to produce that volume of hogs. So this is where we get the number of full-time equivalent jobs that we need to raise the current volume of hogs in each area. And it's also where we get those estimates for how much corn, soybean meal, and other inputs are required for production. We combine what's going on at the farm level with the industry's forward linkages to our packing and processing sector, which are obviously very tied to the hog farming industry and kind of make up that overall pork industry picture. So to get estimates of the direct contributions for those businesses, we look at not only slaughter levels in each state, we also use plant information from FSIS to show us where our large packers and processors are, as well as small and very small processors. And then we use employment and labor income information from the US Census Bureau to come up with those estimates. So we make all of these initial estimates of what the industry is contributing directly to each economy or to the state economy and the US as a whole. And then we plug that into a model within the InPlan software modeling system so that we can calculate the additional indirect and induced effects that are brought on by activity in the pork industry. So those indirect effects are going to be the business to business transactions that are generated when the pork industry purchases inputs and supports other businesses that way. And then the induced impacts stem from spending that occurs with income that's earned in the pork industry and earned in the input supplying industries, but how that's spent throughout the economy and generates additional impacts. So those total numbers are what we have as the result of all of those separate impact levels.
That's a lot of data to wade through. What national figures from this report stood out to you, or what areas did you see significant growth or maybe remained in good standing despite market conditions, supply chain issues these past couple years?
Yeah, I think if we look at those headline national figures, we see in 2021, the U.S. pork industry supported more than 600,000 jobs, as you said, generated nearly $36 billion in personal income, and supported over $57 billion in value added. So this serves as just a snapshot of what happened in 2021 based on the volume of hogs that we raised, the value of those hogs, and the employment and income that was earned in the industry. So obviously sales values were greater in 2021 than in 2020, which definitely supports an additional or a greater level of activity. But definitely some strong figures and definitely shows the way that our industry has grown and changed over the last several years. And we can dig a little bit deeper into these results. As I mentioned, indirect and induced level effects. This is a lot of numbers on one slide, but if you look here at the direct line, the number of jobs that are contained in the pork industry, that's about 180,000. We can see almost $10 billion of personal income paid to employees just on hog farms and in pork packing and processing plants. And as you can see there, a total output value of about $86 billion. But if we look at these other two lines, the indirect level jobs, income, and sales included, as I mentioned, this is the business to business transaction. So this is how the industry is supporting other businesses further up the supply chain. This is our grain farming, our grain farming industry, other services, truck transportation, utilities, and a variety of other businesses. And then that third line there, the induced level effects, is the way that consumers are spending their money throughout the economy and generating additional activity. So as I mentioned here, these total impacts really are significant. And as I also said, have increased over the last couple of years. We can actually look a little bit further, a more detailed look at some of these results and see just what industries are being impacted by pork industry activity. Not surprising that about 20% of these jobs are within the agriculture industry and 26.4% are within manufacturing, which would include our pork packing and processing businesses. But as you can see here, a variety of other industry groups have significant impacts that are tied to the pork industry. We know that pork producers rely on services within the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. So our ag lenders, risk insurance, and other services there. Obviously, truck transportation is extremely important. And then we also have ties to wholesale and retail businesses, construction, and a lot of businesses within the service industry.
I want to get into the state data with you, but before we do that, I just want to remind the audience at home that if they have a question for Holly, they can type into the Q&A or chat function, and we'll get to that at the end of the program during our Q&A portion. More than 11 states reported value-added GDP in the billions. Obviously, we'd expect to see Iowa reporting significant economic contributions like that. But what other states stood out to you that are benefiting quite well economically from the industry?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we look at these state level contribution numbers. As you mentioned, 11 states are contributing more than $1 billion to their state's GDP. And so if you look at this map, this includes all of the states that were included in this round of studies, kind of a heat map, which the darker color is going to represent a larger contribution. And so I think it's interesting to look that we see significant value added, not only in the Midwest and in other states that we know to be some of the larger hog producing regions, but we see significant impacts even further east into Pennsylvania, and particularly going to see greater impacts in states that also have a larger pork processing sector, because as I mentioned, that industry is also included in this study. I think another interesting thing to note is that at the state level, the impacts are calculated based on what occurs within the boundaries of that state. So states that are able to produce a larger portion of their feed grains are going to see larger impacts. And so that's definitely represented here as well, as you see kind of some larger contributions across states that may be supplying more of their own inputs.
And that kind of leads into my next question was, when you break down the states, you break down the number of farms and jobs per state. One might think, well, the states with the most employees and the most farms would most likely see the most economic returns, but that isn't always the case here. Can you expand on these findings and any insight there?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's also, an interesting thing to talk about, because when we can look at, if we were to rank these states, how they may fall, it depends on what criteria you're looking at. So, just because a state may have a greater inventory of hogs doesn't necessarily mean that their overall contribution is going to be, larger than another state. So, as I mentioned, it's important to look at the pork processing sector. So states that have more processing capacity, or maybe even have, a large value added or further processing, maybe a bacon plant or things like that, are going to see larger numbers. And then again, states that are producing a lot of their own inputs are going to generate greater impact. So we may see, a state that has more hogs but is importing a lot of their corn or other inputs may see a lower value added number. And so I think that kind of helps explain why those may not all line up exactly how you may expect. And I think that's an interesting aspect of the state reports.
Well, let's look at the states with the lower levels of production, where maybe their hog production numbers might not be widely known to those outside the agricultural industry. What were some key findings that you think that those states can share with their constituents?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think these state reports have a lot of value for the pork industry within each state, especially our smaller producing states, because although, we may not have the highest number of marketings, we can now look at these numbers and say, this is the total contribution of the pork industry. And it essentially quantifies what would be lost if the pork industry wasn't there. So these states can look at the industries that are impacted by pork production, that have ties to the industry and that are supported by our purchases. And then also, of course, the number of jobs. I think that's an impact and an effect that is really easy, or helps us give perspective of the importance of the industry. So almost every state in this study supports over 1,000 jobs. And so when we look at within each state, as I mentioned, the state only generates impacts for what happens within that state. So we look at the number of jobs, we look at these value-added contributions. And this, if you're looking at maybe a Western producing state, it's all what occurs within that industry.
And that leads into my next question I had, with Smithfield's recent news of decreasing sow herds in Utah. I imagine we'll see some shift in these numbers between states come next year. What market situation and trends will you be watching over the next year?
Yeah, and I think news like that, and that's really, helps remind us why it's important to keep these studies up to date, because these studies serve as just a snapshot of what the industry looks like at a point in time. So these studies look at 2021, a few years down the road, we may see different impacts. Inventories may shift, and that was definitely true when we compare the 2021 results to 5 years ago when this study was done. So we see different levels of pork production, we see maybe expanded packing capacity, and then we see a change in local purchases and things like that. So we'll definitely continue to see how some of the industry's current challenges may shape where those inventories shift, and it will definitely have an impact on what the overall contribution looks like at the national level, but specifically within states, because as I mentioned, it's very important, what's going on specifically within a state. And so we'll definitely be interested to see how that shapes things. And I would also add that we're going to have a new census of agriculture here in the next couple of years. And so that will give us another update on industry demographics, which will, also have an impact on these results.
As we wrap up here, for folks that haven't had a chance to dig in the report yet, what do you think are 2 or 3 takeaways you hope they'd gather here today from this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's important. We talk about pork production numbers all the time. I think it's important to recognize with a study like this, the ties that the pork industry has to other industries. So that's the direct, indirect, and induced impacts. And so, we can look at the industry and how it supports grain farming, the trucking industry, and the service industry throughout each state. I think that's just kind of an important takeaway, because really helps give us a full picture of the importance of the industry. I think it's also, again important to note the sources of growth that the industry has seen, not only in hog production. Obviously, raising more hogs requires additional inputs and services and induces more spending throughout the economy, but also the other ways that these contributions grow. And that's through expanded packing capacity, which brings more jobs and sales to a state economy, as well as increased local purchases. And so would encourage anyone who hasn't had the chance to read these studies to check us out at nppc.org. The pork industry tab contains all of the national data, a link to the report, and then we also have the state reports available there as well.
Great insight and great information. National Pork Producers Council staff economist Holly Cook, Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Anne. Great talking with you.
For you and our audience, we thank you for tuning in. For more coverage and conversations on pork industry related topics, be sure to check out the live and on-demand section of Feedstuffs 365. Earlier this week, we had the opportunity to visit with the National Pork Board and Meta Farms on the latest data from their production benchmarking analysis. If you missed that broadcast, be sure to check it out in the on-demand section of Feedstuffs 365. For Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.